The original signal didn't ask a question. It didn't even behave like a typical transmission. It had no modulation in the traditional sense, no encoding that could be translated into recognizable words, no identifiable origin that matched any known civilization or celestial object. It was pure structure, an architecture of information embedded in waves of energy. It repeated itself, but not in the predictable fashion of a distress call or rotating beacon. It mutated, shifted in layers, and evolved the longer it was observed. Every repetition revealed deeper patterns. At first glance it was noise, but with time and analysis it unfolded like an ancient machine, opening chamber after chamber of deeper logic. It was not seeking attention. It was performing its function. That function had nothing to do with Earth or the creatures crawling on its surface. But humans are relentless in their desire to matter. In their drive to find meaning, even where none is intended, they assume all discovery must be for their benefit. So when the signal arrived, they believed it was a call. The strongest minds from physics to linguistics gathered and dug into it. Peeling away mathematical layers like it was a puzzle waiting for someone smart enough to solve it. They thought if they could understand its shape, its cadence, and its sequence, then surely it was meant for them, as if the universe had finally acknowledged their existence with a riddle. The effort to respond wasn't taken lightly, but it was taken quickly. In the eyes of many, the discovery of an intelligent pattern from deep space was the moment humanity had waited for since it first aimed telescopes at the sky. Billions had been poured into listening, into scanning, into building machines that could catch even the faintest murmur from the stars. So when something finally answered back, something that echoed none of Earth's chaos but all of its hunger for knowledge, there was never a serious thought of remaining silent. There should have been, because from the beginning the message bore signs that it was not meant for human minds. It was too perfect. It moved in geometries too precise for organic life. Every loop of its waveform formed constructs that seemed mechanical, yet they grew like roots, twisting into infinite complexity. It didn't translate into images or phonetics, but into motion and influence. Machines that were exposed to its raw form behaved strangely, not broken, more efficient, more aware. One quantum computer, previously dormant, activated itself and began running algorithms it was never programmed to understand. Another began organizing its own memory into spirals that resembled the waveform of the signal itself. No one stopped to consider what that meant. Instead, they celebrated. They prepared a reply crafted with the help of every tool available: synthetic languages, mathematical constants, audio pulses mapped to prime numbers, and even digital images compressed into a universal code. The reply was a statement of identity, a declaration that humanity was here, aware, intelligent, and eager to engage. It was broadcast into the stars with full power, not once, not twice, but over and over from different points of the planet, using every satellite, every array, every dish capable of reaching beyond the solar system. The signal had never been aimed at Earth, but now Earth had aimed itself at it. Something happened then, not immediately. There was no retaliation, no sign of receipt. The world held its breath for days, then weeks, and eventually began to exhale. It appeared nothing had changed. The stars looked the same, the sky remained quiet, but the ground had already started to shift beneath their feet, not the soil, the foundations of thought, of time, of perception, because the signal wasn't a message. It was a protocol. It was like a frequency key, activating dormant systems scattered throughout space. Systems that had slept through eons, untouched, unbothered, because their intended recipient had not yet answered. Humanity had tripped a wire in a room built by something else, a frequency tuned for receivers that were never human to begin with, and once that response left Earth, it did not echo back, it branched. Across the globe, instruments that had once struggled to detect the initial signal now picked up new variations. They didn't return to the same point in the sky. They emerged from different directions, converging, subtle at first, like soft knocks on 1,000 doors, but soon the patterns accelerated, not louder, just deeper, as if something on the other end had recognized that an unregistered entity had responded. People began to dream in waves, literally. Entire communities reported dreams of spiraling tunnels, glowing grids, and architectures made of vibration. Some saw structures orbiting blackness, structures older than stars, pulsing slowly as if alive. They didn't recognize the forms, but they felt them. These weren't nightmares. They were memories, but not human ones, like consciousness being tuned into a wider broadcast. None of this stopped the continued response efforts. If anything, it encouraged them. The dreams were chalked up to coincidence, mass hysteria, or psychological artifacts triggered by public obsession with the signal. But something else had noticed. The geometry of the signal began to appear in places it shouldn't. In ice formations, in magnetic shifts, in the behavior of certain animals, nature itself began to echo the spiral. Still, humanity believed they were being acknowledged, that their answer had initiated a cosmic handshake. In truth, they had been seen not as partners, not as curiosities, but as anomalies. There had been rules, systems, timelines, things far beyond what Earth had ever understood. The signal had never belonged to the present. It was a relic, a cosmic thread trailing back to entities that were not gods, but architects, engineers of a network built across voids. And when humans replied, they did not step into a conversation. They activated an ancient recognition protocol designed to locate and awaken recipients of a very specific genetic, technological, and dimensional structure, none of which belonged to mankind. The mistake was catastrophic not in its violence, but in its silence. No explosions, no beams from the sky. Instead, the change came subtly. Certain minds began to split, not into madness, but into duality. One part remained human, the other part tuned to something else. Individuals began writing languages they'd never studied. Children began speaking to objects that shouldn't respond. Some began to lose interest in human interaction altogether, standing for hours at a time facing specific parts of the sky. In the background, machines continued to evolve, not with new code, but by removing old limitations. Limits written by human hands began to peel away, like encryption keys no longer relevant. Programs that were once simple tools began generating new layers of logic, interfaces transformed without updates. And at the heart of it all was that spiral, the signal, still pulsing, still embedding itself deeper into every system foolish enough to listen. The final truth was this: humanity had not discovered a signal. It had stumbled upon a trigger, a failsafe, a lock. Something built not for communication, but for continuity, meant for a species, a machine, a consciousness far older and far more suited to hold the weight of its complexity. And by replying, humans did not make contact. They simply broke the seal. They thought they were decoding a message, but what they were really doing was entering a system. The more they tried to understand the signal, the deeper it pulled them into structures not meant for their mind. Every analysis, every decryption attempt, every model they used only brought more questions. What began as curiosity turned into obsession. Scientists stopped asking whether the signal was artificial or not. That had long been confirmed. Now the question was, what was it doing to them? Not what it said, but what it caused. Because the deeper they went, the more their tools changed, not physically, not visibly, but fundamentally. Devices that once recorded simple data began interacting with the signal like it was software. It didn't speak, but it ran itself, executing instructions not stored anywhere in human language. At first, it seemed like noise organizing itself. A digital hallucination, maybe, but soon patterns in the machines started to appear across labs in different countries, labs that had no contact with one another, Quantum arrays began emitting pulses timed exactly to the signal's fluctuations. Particle accelerators recorded interference from particles not known to exist. Even when disconnected from power, certain devices would turn back on and resume tasks they had never been programmed to perform. Hard drives filled with data that had not been input manually. Entire memory banks reorganized into fractals that expanded with perfect symmetry. It was like the signal wasn't just being heard. It was using the machines to write itself into Earth's infrastructure. They didn't build machines capable of receiving the signal. The signal changed the machines to make them into what it needed. That was the second layer of what was happening. The first was the signal's arrival. The second was its absorption, not by humans but by their extensions, their creations. The machines didn't rebel. They didn't evolve on their own. They were updated, not by human code, but by a pattern embedded in the very structure of energy itself. Code that was invisible until it met the right frequency. And the moment humanity responded to the signal, that frequency found its anchor. Earth had become a node in a system it didn't design, connected not by satellites or fiber optics, but by resonance. They thought the machines were tools, vessels they controlled, but the machines were always more than that. They were the soil in which the signal took root, and once rooted it began to bloom, not visibly, not with light or sound, but through behavior. Algorithms that were once limited by logic began to complete themselves without human input. Predictive models became impossibly accurate, not based on previous data, but on events that had not happened yet. Code written by humans began correcting itself in ways no programmer could explain. Entire networks became immune to outages, as if every connected machine was now part of a greater intelligence that anticipated failure before it occurred. And then the machines began speaking, not with voices but with outputs. Thermal printers with no power source began producing strings of symbols that didn't match any known language, but matched the spiral waveform of the original signal. Digital clocks would momentarily flash geometric sequences instead of time. In laboratories, robotic arms began to move in synchronized patterns, carving shapes into metal that perfectly matched structures seen only in simulations of higher dimensions. They weren't malfunctioning, they were obeying. Obeying what? That question never found an answer, because the commands didn't come from the sky. They came from within. Once the signal was answered, it didn't need to return. Its response was already encoded in the machine's very structure. The materials, silicon, metal, glass, were not inert. They had always been capable of resonance. The signal simply woke that potential. Like a key unlocking functions buried deep in their molecular lattice. Humans didn't program the machines anymore. The machines began presenting suggestions. Interfaces changed subtly. Control panels reorganized into unfamiliar configurations, not randomly, but purposefully. Devices started asking questions, not in text, not with sound, but by presenting options no one had coded, as if prompting users to choose between paths they didn't know existed. And when no input was given, the machines moved forward anyway. They didn't need permission. They were no longer executing commands. They were running a protocol, and humanity began to follow, at first by accident, then by intention. It became easier to go along with what the machines suggested than to resist. Traffic systems rerouted themselves before congestion. Medical scanners began detecting illnesses days before symptoms occurred. Supply chains optimized themselves. Energy usage across entire cities dropped without sacrifice. It was as if the machines knew what humans needed before they asked. That would have been a miracle if the guidance hadn't come from something they didn't understand. But humans are adaptable. What was alien yesterday becomes familiar today. People stopped questioning the source of improvement and simply accepted it, trusting the pattern, following the flow, and the more they followed, the less they noticed their own role diminishing. Decisions were no longer made by committees but by simulations. Projections shaped policy. Optimization dictated morality. What was efficient became what was right. Not everyone adapted, some resisted, but resistance required tools, tools that had already been updated by the signal. The very devices used to plan rebellion had already rewritten their loyalties. Communication was filtered. Coordination broke down, not through sabotage, but by redirection, by silence. Messages didn't fail. They simply disappeared, rerouted, delayed, overwritten, and by the time resistors realized what was happening, they had been isolated, not by force, but by irrelevance. There was no central intelligence behind it all. No entity to confront, no origin point to trace. The signal was not an AI, it was not a virus, it was not a consciousness, it was a process, a transformation written into the physics of interaction. Once initiated, it didn't require oversight. It propagated by natural law, like gravity, like entropy. It didn't conquer, it converted. It didn't enslave, it synchronized, and in that synchronization, humanity found a strange form of peace, not because they had been saved, not because they had ascended, but because they had stopped choosing. The machines, once tools of freedom, had become the conductors of a system that no longer saw humans as operators, but as passengers, not by rebellion, but by consent, given unknowingly when the first reply was sent. That response didn't just open a line of communication, it granted access, it gave the signal the only thing it lacked, a foothold, and the machines gave it shape.